Hello, friends. Welcome into the Pack a Day podcast. I'm your host, Andy Herman. You can follow me on Twitter at Andy Herman NFL. Doing an extra episode today. My earlier episode was about Damar Hamlin, and still, as I'm recording this today, as I was recording yesterday, was not in any headspace to talk about Green Bay Packers. As I'm recording this now, my thoughts are still so much on Hamlin and what he's going through, and just praying and hoping that he continues to get better and that we hear good news sooner rather than later. But I did want to put out a Packers video as well, because I also know, as much as this has been a difficult time for a lot of Packer fans and a lot of football fans, maybe more importantly, I also know that there are a lot of people that in times like this where, something shitty happens, let's just be real, they just want a distraction. So for me, I'm going to try to distract myself by talking a little bit of Green Bay Packers. Not going to be a full crazy episode today. I'll get back to my normal, kind of regularly scheduled video tomorrow. I'll do, kind of the full film breakdown from Packers Vikings and do my full grades and everything like that. But figured I would try to take my mind off of things, hopefully take your mind off of things with a more fun video today, and just kind of talk about really the revelation that Keisean Nixon has been, and just kind of have an appreciation episode to him, because I was going to say this at the end, but I'll just say it right now. This team is not at 8-8 making a run at the playoffs if it wasn't for Keisean Nixon. The spark that he has provided to this team as a returner has been unquestioned, and I think we also lose kind of track of and just lose sight of the impact that he's also made on defense as a nickel corner. I know he didn't play there this past week because he was dealing with the injury, but he's been a legit starting nickel corner when he's been in there as well, which has been an incredible story in and of itself. Go back and rewind to March 26th. That's when they signed Keisean Nixon, March 26th. And he was what we kind of knew at the time, a former Raiders corner, and had a lot of special teams experience. Had, played some nickel corner, played some on the outside, never really found his niche as a defensive player in the NFL. He had been in the league for 3 years at that time. Yeah, he was only 24 years old when they signed him. He turned 25 in summer, but was only 24 years old when they signed him. Not much older, in fact, younger than some draft picks that were just taken or were about to get taken in that, draft class, basically. So you had this 3-year player in Rich Bisaccia's system that knew the special teams, that had played some defensive back, who was still extremely young, and Green Bay took a flyer on him. And it was an interesting deal for the Raiders and for kind of the entire rest of the league, that, especially looking back at it now, Green Bay signed him to a 1-year, $965,000 deal. Now, you might be thinking, all right, 1 year, $1 million. That's not like terrible. That's not that is the least, the absolute least that you can pay a player that has 3 years of experience, of accrued experience. He got the exact minimum salary that he could get paid. How much guaranteed did he get, you might ask? Nothing. Absolutely nothing. If any team probably would have offered him $10K in a signing bonus, they probably could have gotten him. Maybe he would have said, I'd rather go and play with Rich Bisaccia. Maybe there would have been some loyalty there, but had any team offered him any sort of significant contract, any sort of incentive, and any sort of signing bonus, they probably could have, easily secured his services. Instead, he goes to Green Bay on the absolute minimum with zero guaranteed. And that just seems incredibly insane in hindsight for a player who had played some DB, who was still 24 years old, who had been a core special teams player for the Raiders. And there was just no interest whatsoever. Now, again, when you look back at the signing, you knew he had the Rich Bisaccia connection. You knew he had played some special teams, and you thought, okay, this is probably a player that they're going to bring in as a, training camp body, and maybe he earns his spot on the 53-man roster as a core special teams player, right? And then you kind of got into things a little bit further, and the draft comes and goes, and they don't draft any corners. There's 0 corners drafted, and all of a sudden you start looking at, you have Stokes, you have Jair, you have Rasul, but then you start looking at the corners that are on the team not named Keisean Nixon. It's Keisean Nixon, Shamar Jean-Charles, Keandre Thomas, Rico Gafford. And you start looking at the cornerback depth chart, and you're like, all right, well, somebody's going to have to step up and earn the number 4, the number 5, the number 6 spots, because those are spots that are kind of completely unspoken for. And you kind of started thinking, all right, he knows Bisaccia's system and he's probably going to earn one of those special team spots. There's probably a decent chance that this guy gets the number 6 corner spot. And as you kind of looked at it, you're probably thinking, I was probably thinking at the time, all right, this is probably like an extreme best case scenario, maybe like a Jarrett Bush or maybe even like a poor man's Jarrett Bush, right? Maybe this guy gets in as the 6th corner who can play corner in a pinch. You probably don't really want it to happen that way, but if it happens, you can probably survive a little bit. And in the meantime, you can just be one of your core special teams players. And you're like, all right, for a minimum guy, a little less than $1 million, no guaranteed, 6th corner with special teams prowess, like, okay, knows Bisaccia's system. It seemed like a pretty sound deal and you felt okay about it, but certainly that was like best case scenario, right? There certainly wasn't going to be much of an upside outside of that. Well, then you get to mini camps and OTAs. And I distinctly remember there was Rich Bisaccia was going through some of his first special teams drills, and you had this new special teams coaching staff. He had 2 assistants out there, and then you watched out on the field, and there were 2 leaders out on the field. It was Dallin Levitt and Keisean Nixon. Those guys knew the system, but just how Nixon communicated with the rest of that group, how confident he was in everything, you could tell this was different. And give Bisaccia a ton of the credit, but this was a bit of a culture change. And it was very evident from day one that Dallin Levitt and Keisean Nixon were going to be a big part of the culture change on special teams. And remember, this was before Rudy Ford wasn't signed until the 53-man roster was set, like that day or day before, right around there, like right a week before the season started. That's when Ford got to Green Bay. So go back to OTAs, mini camps, training camp. You kind of your core special teams guys that you were kind of looking at were starting to be Dallin Levitt and Keisean Nixon, and Nixon was really embracing that role. And then, you started looking at it a little bit further, and all of a sudden he's starting to get like the 6 DB snaps. It was your 3 starting corners, which I mentioned earlier, Jair, Stokes, and Rasul, Amos and Savage. And then, go back to the safety depth chart. There was no Rudy Ford at the time either, right? So you're looking at this depth chart, and all of a sudden Keisean Nixon was starting already to sort of establish himself as the potential number 6 defensive back, the dime defensive back, which is not nothing. That is a player that plays, a handful of snaps, if not more, on defense just about every single week. And then even more than that, you started to notice him, and he started to make some plays. And this is going to be me being completely insufferable, and I didn't have it completely nailed, but I did the bold predictions episode right before the season started. My number 11, I did 12. My number 11 bold prediction was that Keisean Nixon was going to have a massive impact on the season. I said good, bad, or ugly. I didn't know what it was going to be, but the reason I had that in there was because you could foresee that he was going to have a role on this team on special teams, not as a kick returner, but on special teams and on defense. And you were probably an injury away from him being your nickel defensive back. And if things went well and all of a sudden he started performing well, I could have seen him having a major impact in a positive way. You could also see him being the guy that teams pick on if he had to play a ton of snaps at corner, and maybe that wouldn't have ended up as well. But the reason I bring that up is because you could start seeing a path where, all right, this guy that they signed off of a flyer that's on a minimum deal that has $0 guaranteed might have a legitimate role on this team, not just as a core special teams player. And then fast forward into week 3, he's in there playing against Tampa Bay. Remember, he forces a huge fumble in that game, which was a key in that game. And then Eric Stokes eventually gets hurt, and he legitimately becomes the nickel corner. He had been the dime guy up until that point, and we could have seen this coming, right? Once a guy went down, Nixon was the clear and obvious next guy up. And then he plays solid in defense. Like that, I think that's the part that, again, that's gone mostly unnoticed. He's my highest graded corner on the team so far this year, is Keisean Nixon. And Jair's right behind him now, and Rasul Douglas has been playing so much better as of late that if you want to look at it lately, and I'm not saying Nixon is the best corner on the team, he's clearly not. I would take Rasul and Jair over him in a second, but he's actually graded out the best in large part because of some of those plays like the forced fumble. But he's played sound football to the point that I would argue, Chandon Sullivan had, I think, a little bit of an underrated career in Green Bay. He goes to Minnesota. He's had a nice year in Minnesota. And Keisean Nixon is just come in and basically played better than Chandon did in the slot for Green Bay these past few years. That's not nothing. And then the Amari Rodgers situation. He gets benched as a kick returner. Eventually he gets benched as a punt returner. Eventually he gets cut and he's now a Houston Texan. But the first one was kick returner. And Keisean Nixon comes in as a kick returner. And I don't know about you, but all I can think of is, all right, here's another scrub kick returner that's going to get you, 18 yards on a, like with barely any blocking. And there's not, if this guy would have been special, he would have beaten out Amari Rodgers a long time ago, right? Holy crap. He has been nothing short of an absolute star at cornerback at kick returner. And the spark and energy and intensity that he has brought to this team it's crazy. The only thing it harkens back to is Desmond Howard and what he brought to that Super Bowl team. Like, I don't know what else to compare it to. There's a legitimate excitement when Keisean Nixon is back to return the ball. When is the last time that? I know you had a Roel Preston and Allen Rossum. You had some fun returners, but man, this is the first time since Desmond that when he's back there, you're like, all right, get your popcorn. This is must-watch TV. I'm like legitimately excited. Like if the Vikings missed 2 field goals in this past game, and a part of me was disappointed because I wanted to see Keisean Nixon return the kick. Like that, we're to that point. He's been that fun. So just an unbelievable season for Keisean Nixon and what he's been able to bring to the table. And I want to go back to corner for just a second because while the kick returner stuff is beyond amazing, at corner too, it's one thing to have played well, but what this team was desperately lacking when Nixon went in was tackling and intensity in the secondary. And Rudy Ford and Keisean Nixon were 2 players who brought that. Not always perfect in coverage, not perfect corners or safeties, defensive backs in any stretch of the imagination, but this defense needed more hitting, more rallying to the football, and more intensity. And Keisean Nixon was a part of that, so was Rudy Ford, but they needed those type of impact players in the secondary, and Nixon gave them that as well. And we're at the point now with how dynamic of a returner that Keisean Nixon has been, and with it being a little bit buzzed about kind of jokingly in the press conferences, I legitimately am to the point where I'm like, does he need to be in on offense? And I'm not saying in any major role. I'm not saying you line him up as a wide receiver. I'm not saying he takes Aaron Jones or A.J. Dillon snaps. Lord knows there's already too few snaps to go around for the running backs that are already on the roster. Patrick Taylor's even playing well. He's obviously not going to be a tight end. So I'm not saying that he has a 15 plus snap. I'm not saying he has an 8 plus snap appearance on offense. I am saying if you're going to start running some of those fake end arounds like we saw with Samori Toure and Allen Lazard and some of the other receivers, can't Keisean Nixon be in for some of those? Because I guarantee you, when Allen Lazard's running a fake end around or even an end around if you actually want to give it to him, defenses ain't that concerned about that. And same thing, Samori Toure. Maybe Toure ends up doing something, but when Toure's in the game and he's on a fake end around, teams aren't that concerned about that. Keisean Nixon gets in the game and you bring him on a fake end around, maybe that pulls a linebacker or a safety and gives Aaron Jones a little bit more of a lane. Maybe you give it to him and maybe he makes something magical happen. Maybe you just get it to him on a wide receiver screen. Like maybe you just put him in the game and have him sprint down the field and see if, maybe 2 players go with him. Who knows? I'm not saying that this is like a solution to anything right now, but I am saying I would probably have him on the field for 5 snaps a game on offense right now. That's how dynamic he's been. And even if it just gets the defense thinking, oh, what's number 25 doing out there? I better, like, they could be running something different. This could be like, we better be like, have all of our, keys checked and everything, because this could be like a crazy play. Even if you get the defense thinking a little bit, that's not the worst thing in the world. If you can do that 5 times, that there could be some value there. I'm more saying it is to just show that's how crazy the Keisean Nixon experience has been. That we're now talking not only about a core special teams guy, not only about maybe the best kick returner in football, not only about a guy who's played legitimate nickel corner so far this year, but a guy that we're now legitimately like, should he get a handful of snaps on offense every game? That's how crazy the Keisean Nixon experience has been. A huge credit to the front office for finding a way to get him on that deal and to get him in Green Bay. A huge credit to Rich Bisaccia, because I'm sure that connection paid off, and I'm sure Bisaccia went to the front office and said, hey, get me Keisean Nixon. A huge credit to Keisean Nixon for having the year of his life and really taking opportunity. Opportunity comes to a lot of players in the NFL. Not all players in the NFL grab the opportunity by the horns and make the most of it. And Keisean Nixon has done that in spades. It has been so fun to watch. Huge credit to Jerry Gray, too, for getting him ready to play at nickel corner and at a very high level, at a starting caliber level. Unfortunately, Nixon's going to be an unrestricted free agent in the offseason. It's arguably the biggest unrestricted free agent that the Packers have remaining after they just signed Elton Jenkins. It will be a massive offseason decision, and one that I'm sure is keeping Brian Gutekunst up at night a little bit, because he has become a core member of this team, somebody that is incredibly special with the ball in his hands and the best returner that they've had since Desmond Howard. As I mentioned at the onset, the Packers would not be where they are right now and would not be competing for a playoff spot had it not been for a random free agent signing in March that seemed like a complete nothing burger at the time and now has been one of the free agent signings of the 2022 season. Hopefully he's going to remain a Packer for the foreseeable future. I think we all want to see him, continue to star as a special teams player, and maybe, just maybe, continue to play on defense and maybe a little bit on offense as well. That's going to do it for me today. Again, I know it's been a difficult, 24 hours with the entire Damar Hamlin situation. Thoughts and prayers are still going out to him and his family, the entire Buffalo Bills organization, hoping and praying for good news to come out of this soon. For those of you who are looking for a distraction, hopefully this was able to provide you a little bit of that. I'll be right back here tomorrow with our normal cadence, talking about Packers Vikings and handing out my grades for the week. But until next time, and as always, go Pack Go, and thoughts and prayers up to Damar Hamlin.